Let's move to Melissa Cook, who's of African Sunrise Partners, but she's also part of President Obama's business advisory group, and so she has two hats, and she will tell us how she views co-investment and investment in Africa.
Okay, well, I first have to say my Milken connection is that I started my research career at Drexel Burnham, which was where the home of Mike Milken. And I still have a T-shirt that says "Junk Bonds Keep America Fit." So I think fondly of those days, just a few blocks from here. I'm going to give a little bit of background and some perspective. I've worked in Wall Street banks for 25 years as an equity research analyst covering all types of global sectors. Started traveling to Africa as a tourist in 2007 and very quickly realized in Kenya there was really something very different going on. It wasn't just when our travel guide pulled out his phone and made a payment using M-Pesa when they were in the absolute middle of nowhere. It was the shopping centers, the billboards, the GT Bank advertisements in Heathrow, and I just said this is really something different. Started my own business 5 years ago basically to try to bring more institutional investors and more US companies to the continent. I always joke that my clients are Americans who think Africa is one country. And so for the people who think that, who are in this room, thank you for coming, because it's a really good opportunity just to get from the horse's mouth some of the great information that you will need. So what I do is travel to the continent 5 or 6 times a year, more than 35 trips, almost 40 trips overall. And I go and talk to almost anyone who will talk to me. That's everyone from my driver and the people in the informal markets, all the way up to the biggest listed companies, the dealers and distributors for Caterpillar and Coca-Cola and the other multinationals. And I think it's so important to have, as we heard from some of the previous speakers, boots on the ground. There's just nothing, there's nothing to substitute for actually going and seeing what's really happening and going back on a regular basis and then going to new countries and seeing where maybe that country is headed that's slightly different from the ones that you know something about. So in my regular work, I don't focus so much on co-investing, so sorry, I'm not going to emphasize that, but I'm really very interested in bridging the gap. So I spend a lot of my time speaking with institutional investors here in the US, and also speaking with African governments, with regulators, with business, to try to help each side understand or translate into a language that everybody can understand. So for example, we've heard from some of the pension funds that are thinking about increasing their Africa allocation. Where I see most of my business is really with the global fund managers who are running a business where they have a fairly liberal allocation in terms of being able to go global, to go frontier, to go emerging, and they're interested in where the next driver of growth is going to come from. But too many people look at Africa and they say, oh my God, 54 countries, it's a lot of work, it's pretty far away, I'm just going to go do something else. And so I think my message to the African companies and regulators and governments is anything that adds complexity makes it more difficult for an investor to justify spending the time going to that country. I do it, I'm happy to do it. I've logged almost 5 million miles with American Airlines and its affiliates, but you know, not everybody's willing to do that, and it's a lot of work and a lot of expense. The other thing that I hear a lot about is let's get people to come into projects. Well, as we heard on one of the panels before, big institutions don't buy projects, they buy financial instruments. And this is something that I've been working very closely with my colleagues and partners on the President's Advisory Council, of which Wale is one, to try to help people understand the need for development of African capital markets, as well as additional securities and vehicles that maybe are listed in New York or London or Mauritius, that are more investable and more liquid for these really big institutions. It's very simple math. If you're running a $100 billion portfolio and you have 100 positions, you have the math that shows you how long you have in your bylaws to how many days trading volume, you know, how many days it's going to take you to build a position and sell a position down. So I'm actually quite encouraged by what I see in terms of the securities exchanges. I thought we had some very good commentary today. I always visit stock exchanges when I travel, and I think there's a lot of innovation. There's a lot of consistency coming through in terms of the technology and the regulatory environment, and that's very helpful. I was able to attend a Milken Institute event in Kenya, at which I spoke up and said to some of the private company CEOs that were in the room, you guys should be listed. If you were to list, you would add another $1 billion of market cap to your local stock exchange, and let's just get that to happen. I think there's an opportunity for dual listings. I understand why companies want to be listed locally to develop their local stock exchanges, but I think it makes it much easier for big institutions if companies can be listed also maybe in Johannesburg, maybe in London, maybe in Mauritius. It just makes it much easier. And then again, in my function as a bridge, I'm really trying to get people to think about creative new vehicles that will open up what I view as a wall of money in the U.S. that's looking for an opportunity to invest in growth but can't make the math work. And I think we've got lots of opportunity. And then finally, in my business, I go out and I kick the tires and do all the groundwork, and I try to educate the very most senior people who are on the boards or the chief investment officers. And one of the speakers earlier said, going into, say, Africa Rising is not going to pass the board. That's totally true. And you have to have somebody inside the team or an advisor to them who's able to come in and say, I've seen all these companies, I've seen these countries, and here's what's really happening and going on. And I would encourage the big investors to find the budget and find the staff, go to the Harvard Africa Conference and pick somebody out of the graduating class or one of the business school conferences to find people who are willing to get on a plane and go and do that type of research. So that doesn't answer the co-investing question, but hopefully it gives you something else to chew on.
Doing business in Africa. You can't afford to be without Africa Investor.